So, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in to today's topic. So, today we're going to be talking about inclusive leadership during polarized time. So, keeping teams safe when opinions are clashing. And we are living in a world at the moment where we are seeing a rise in polarization, and this polarization is showing up at work. The all of the stuff that's going on in the outside world unfortunately doesn't stay in the outside world. Our organizations act like a vacuum. They suck up anything that's happening outside of our organization. But from a leadership perspective, we need to focus on what we can control and the kind of culture or the kind of an environment that we want to create internally for our people. One of the exercises that I often do with my clients is to take them through a pattern analysis. If anyone has done a business degree or uh, a, a, an MBA or anything like that, they will be familiar with PESTLE. PESTLE is an acronym for all of the outside forces that can affect our business. So it stands for political, economical, social, technological, legal or regulatory, and environmental forces. And senior leaders will very often do some horizon scanning to understand what's going on outside of the four walls of our organization and what's going on in the world and what's going on in our markets. And how are these forces going to have a positive or negative effect on our business in terms of the opportunities or threats that are available to us. But actually, very few senior leaders stop to think about how these forces impact the inclusivity of our workforces. So what's happening politically, for example? What are the messages that are coming out from Donald Trump and the White House that are affecting how our people are thinking and feeling within the organization? How's the economy affecting people? So, for example, the cost of living crisis that we're going through, or as we're recording this webinar, we've just had the 2025 budget in the UK. And so a lot of the decisions that the government have made, how is that going to affect people's affordability? There are unfortunately people who struggle to pay for the public transport to get to and from work in our society, for instance, and that has an impact on people's ability to access employment or their well-being once they are within employment. For example, with technology, we're seeing a huge increase in the use of AI. One of my clients is Cult Technology Services. They wrote a really great report recently about the impact of AI on the workplaces. And what we did say in the report is that there is um, an impact on women in the workplace, for example, where you've got maybe a lack of gender balance at the top of an organization, and you've got more women in kind of more junior or admin roles, for instance, where companies are looking to replace those roles with AI, that is having a detrimental impact on women, for example, in particular. So there is a gender angle to this as well. So there are all sorts of outside forces that are unfortunately having a negative impact on people at work and their sense of inclusion. So what do we do about this? The first thing I think we need to do is we need to equip leaders to be able to facilitate or create safe spaces. This is something that we talk about a lot. I keep banging the drum about this. It's all about psychological safety, people's ability to feel able to speak up, share ideas, challenge the status quo without any fear of criticism or backlash. It's something that if you work within the EDI space or you work within the HR teams, it's something that you're going to be really familiar with. And Brené Brown talks about this in terms of creating safe spaces and as leaders leaning into our vulnerabilities and sharing our vulnerabilities. What she also talks about, though, is that we need to complement that with brave spaces. It's not okay just to create the safe space, because actually creating a safe space for certain individuals doesn't necessarily create a safe space for everybody in the organization who are feeling underrepresented or challenged somehow. So we need to be able to also create these brave spaces or have radical candor, as Kim Scott puts it in her book. And what that means is that we have those difficult or awkward conversations. We don't shy away from them. We lean into having those difficult conversations rather than running away. We get inquisitive. We try to dig beneath what's presented to us on a surface level as a leader and get really curious about what's going on. And interestingly, having that kind of open-mindedness and learning orientation is one of the 6 key inclusive leadership behaviors that we often measure when we do inclusive leadership training with senior leaders. Now, I've talked about psychological safety and this kind of radical candor, and it does actually marry up very nicely with the model that Patrick Lencioni created. He calls it the 5 dysfunctions of a team. It's very commonly used in businesses, but often we don't think of this with an EDI lens over it. So when we look at Patrick Lencioni, what he says is that dysfunctional teams, as he puts it, they have a lack of trust at the bottom of the pyramid, and they also avoid conflict. Now, I'm only focusing on the bottom 2 layers of his pyramid here. There are 3 other layers above these 2 that are pictured on the screen. But high-performing teams, they do a really good job at building trust, and therefore it creates this culture of openness rather than being guarded. And they also do a really good job at managing conflict or resolving conflict. And that means that they work in very candid teams rather than teams that build up resentment and try to brush things under the carpet. I read a really good book on the train to London yesterday as I was about to speak at a conference. And in the book, it said there are 3 elements to building trust with your line manager. One, you need to know that your line manager is competent at being able to do what they should be doing. Secondly, your line manager sticks to their promises. They do what they say they are going to do. And then thirdly, you feel like your line manager has got your best interests at heart or has got your back. And I thought that was a nice triad in terms of thinking about how we build trust within teams. When it comes to creating inclusive work environments, people don't follow policies or procedures, or they should be following procedures, but people don't tend to follow policies or procedures that are written down. People do follow the behaviors that are going on in the organization. And when I wrote my first book, Inclusive Growth, I wrote a whole chapter on culture, and it was the most difficult chapter to write. And I actually started the chapter by saying, this is the most difficult chapter that I'm writing, because I found it really difficult to try and get my arms around what we exactly mean by culture. It just seems so vast and broad and unwieldy to me. But really, for me, and the golden nugget that I had was for the senior partner that I worked with at Deloitte. And she said that actually culture is quite simple. It's the sum of our behaviors moment to moment. So we need to be thinking about the behaviors that our leaders are role modeling or exhibiting moment to moment, day to day, because that creates a ripple effect. It affects the culture of the organization, it affects the performance of the team, and it affects the positive or negative reputation that your company or your employer brand is happening. Because senior leaders are responsible for setting the tone from the top of the organization. A favorite saying of mine is that culture is caught, not taught. And if you are a senior leader, I hate to break the news to you, but people are watching you, whether you like it or not. And they are actively emulating your behaviors consciously or unconsciously, because the way that you behave is giving permission to others to behave in a similar way. And if we are to work on building this inclusive culture, it shouldn't be coming out of the HR department. It's not just the HR department's responsibility. The whole senior leadership team of the organization should be focusing on this. And to become a senior leader is not about adding more to your plate. It's not about asking you to do things, extra things. It's about honing your craft, tinkering around the edges, tweaking things so that you go from being a good leader to a great leader. So we're not asking you to reinvent the wheel here. And a lot of the inclusive leadership workshops that I do with my clients, for example, it's all about identifying those like 1% changes that senior leaders could be making. So with that in mind, and I alluded to this earlier, what are 6 inclusive leadership behaviors? Now, this is a framework that was created by a company called Talergy that we work with. They are a team of occupational psychologists. They have assessments that cover all of the different stages of the employee life cycle. One of their assessments, if you want to Google it, is called the Talergy Perceptions Assessment. It's a way of measuring inclusive leadership behaviours. It was actually born out of a project that they did with the Metropolitan Police in London. And they identified 6 key behaviours that leaders need to be exhibiting. So we've got empathy, and this is about sensing other people's experiences and perspectives and creating a safe space for people to open up to you and share what they're going through. It's not about jumping to conclusions. It's not about saying, oh, I feel really sorry for you. I've been in a similar situation. Here's what I did. Here's what I think you should do. That's not empathy. Empathy is about holding the space for people to be able to open up and share their concerns and ideas and things with you. We've also got relationship building, which is about forming authentic cross-cultural connections. As human beings, we have a similarity bias. We like to hang out with people like ourselves. But with relationship building, it's about consciously moving beyond that and forming connections with people that we wouldn't ordinarily hang out with. Thirdly, we've got a learning orientation, and that's about staying curious and humble at the same time. It's about seeking out new information and new knowledge. We have open-mindedness, which is about suspending our judgments and embracing differences and being open to doing things in different ways or being open to different ideas or different perspectives. And ultimately, this one of my favorites is composure. And this is about being able to manage our emotions and manage our reactions when we're working in very difficult or unfamiliar contexts. I worked with a senior leader who was actually really highly composed. He came out as a 10 out of 10. And when I did my debrief session with him, I said, okay, which of these 6 behaviors do you want to dial up or dial down? He said, actually, I want to dial down on composure because sometimes I get accused of my team that I don't care, but actually I do care really deeply. But sometimes I come off as a bit cold, but actually I'm a very warm, approachable person. So we had some really interesting conversations about how we could practically address that. And then finally, flexibility. And this is about adapting your leadership style to meet other people where they're at. Flexing your style so that other people can perform in their role the way that they feel that they are best performing their role, for example. So adapting your style to the different styles of people in your team. So those are the 6 behaviors. If you are interested in doing the assessment, then just Google Talergy Perceptions Assessment or just give me an email and we can arrange that for you. But it's a very useful, practical framework to be using. So what are the real sticking points here? Because when we do work with senior leaders, I think we often have to move through different stages. First of all, we've got leaders who are operating at this kind of unconscious exclusion stage. They just don't know what they don't know. They're not aware of how their behaviors or actions or decisions are having positive or negative impact on people. A lot of senior leaders will say to me things like, well, I just treat everybody the same. But that's equality, that's not equity. It's not about understanding in the individual, what the individual needs to be able to perform at their best. And when leaders are working under stress and pressure, as human beings, we tend to default to our habits. And if our habits are to kind of work in a not particularly inclusive way, then we're not doing a really great job at creating the inclusive environment that we should be creating. Then we come across kind of performative inclusion. So we come across those leaders or organizations that they're just going through the motions, they're just ticking the boxes. They might do something like sponsor Pride Month for a month. They might change their logo and their website to the rainbow colors for a month every year. But actually, the lived experience and the reality for LGBTQ plus employees in the organization is that it's not a particularly inclusive place to work if you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, for instance. So how do we actually move beyond those surface level box ticking, window dressing, performative actions to something that's a lot more meaningful and sustainable for the long term? And then we want to ideally move to an intentional, inclusive leadership culture where leaders are really aware of their behaviors and they're being really proactive. They're really empowering leaders and they're being strong allies in the work that we're trying to do. So when it comes to managing difficult situations, because we started this presentation by talking around about how we're dealing with polarization in the workplace, there are three key principles that I think we need to be aware of. First of all, as a leader, we just need to calm the temperature down. If you imagine you're going into a heated situation, let's just take a breath, calm the situation down, because when we're working under strong emotions, it really reduces our clarity and it increases the defensiveness in leadership and the people that we are leading. So we need to be able to slow the pace down because it helps people just shift from reacting, being defensive, to thinking. And so that could just be doing a brief pause in if something heated comes up in a meeting, taking a breath. And that in itself just creates a safer baseline before addressing the elephant in the room or the issue that we need to tackle. We then need to think about the difference between identity and behavior, because sometimes, often heated discussions slip into personal judgments. I might say, "Oh, John, you're such an idiot." We're starting to label people for doing things, and it becomes really personal. So we need to shift the focus from intention to impact. So we might say, that comment that you made or that belief that you've got, I know that might not be your intention, but this is the impact that it's having on the team or on individuals. And this helps to kind of move us away from framing people as kind of the good people or the bad people, where we're focusing on impact rather than intention. And it starts to also create the space where people can just think things over and adjust their behaviors without feeling personally attacked. Because somebody might come back and go, you know what, actually, yeah, that wasn't my intention. The words came out wrong, or I'm just having a bad day. I had a sleepless night. I've got a new baby, kept me up all night. But there's all sorts of things going on in people's lives that influence how we react to different situations. And then the third principle is that we need to make disagreeing safe. Disagreement in life, in relationships and work is very normal. The risk, though, is how disagreements are handled, whether they're handled well or badly. So what we need to be able to do is start inviting views early so that we can start to uncover hidden tensions. So thinking back to the 5 dysfunctions of a team model, that's around that avoiding conflict level, the second level on the pyramid. It's about doing more radical candour, as Kim Scott puts it in her book. I would highly recommend reading her book, by the way. So yeah, invite views early, try not to brush things under the carpet. and agree with your team some really simple rules of engagement to make discussions fair and predictable. So we actually use in the practice, we actually use some really great techniques called from the thinking environment, which is created by somebody called Nancy Klein. She wrote a really good book called Time to Think. And in her model, there are lots of techniques, like she calls it a round, for example, where if you imagine you're sat around a big boardroom table, and you go around the room and one person speaks at a time, and you have the option of saying, I've got nothing to contribute, or come back to me later if you want to. But the whole idea of doing a round is that everybody knows that they're going to get their turn to speak. You also listen to understand, because often we listen with the intention of replying. So it increases the quality of thinking in the room. So that's a simple technique that you could use with your team. Um, and also, leaders who exhibit curiosity set the tone for having these safe and honest debates as well. So again, that's linking back to one of the inclusive leadership behaviors that I talked about earlier. So we need to, this is with those principles in mind though, this is a kind of blueprint that you could use um, to manage situations as well. So the first one, calm, this is about lowering that emotional temperature that I talked about before trying to solve the issue. You might say things like, let's just take a moment. I'd like us to slow this down, or can we take a breath before we continue? So what we're doing with this is that we're helping the team to settle so that no one reacts from fear or frustration. And this first step is really essential because no one can think clearly when they're feeling threatened or under the spotlight. The second step of this framework is agreeing the rules. So in this, you just set simple shared expectations for how you want to talk to each other. Don't create a long list. Just two or three sentences or bullet points are really good that you say out loud. As a leader, the kind of things that you might want to say are, let's listen without interrupting, or let's focus on understanding each other, not winning the other argument, or let's stay curious. And these simple rules of engagement just give people a sense of safety and fairness. We're not telling people what to think. You're not giving them, sorry, you are giving them a safe way to talk. The third stop is about modeling behaviors. And this is where you show the behavior that you want others to copy. If you remember that kind of ripple effect diagram that I showed earlier. And leaders are responsible for setting the tone. So if you stay calm, curious, and respectful yourself, other people are going to be follow. So as a leader, some of the things that you could do is just ask clarifying questions, admit when you don't know something, that requires vulnerability, acknowledge impact without getting defensive yourself, and say something like, I may get this wrong, but I just want to understand. It only takes one or two people modeling this kind of behavior to soften the whole room. And that's really important. That's how you can role model. The fourth step is about closing well. And this is about finishing the conversation safely and cleanly. It avoids people leaving with tension, confusion, or resentment. And you do this by just summarizing the things that you heard, checking in with how people are feeling, clarifying what happens next, asking if anyone needs support before moving on, and closing well just brings the temperature down again so that the issue doesn't continue to simmer. So, in short, calm the room, set simple rules, model curiosity, and close the conversation. Those are the steps that you can take with this particular blueprint. Because when we are talking about creating inclusive cultures, it's quite good to think about, are we creating an inclusive culture, or do we just have a surface level welcoming culture here? A welcoming culture is filled with politeness and friendliness and how people present themselves to each other. They're very smiley, they're very nice to one another. There might be some toxic positivity going on here. It's a nice environment to work in, but it's not necessarily an inclusive environment to work in. Because actually, when we're talking about creating an inclusive culture, there are four pillars: respect, empowerment, belonging, and progression. We want to feel respected for who we really are. We want to bring as much of ourselves to work as we would like to bring. We like to feel empowered by our managers. We want to feel that we belong to the team or the organization and that I can progress my career whilst I'm working for you. And we're working in a culture where different ideas, different perspectives are actually sought, embraced, and considered. So just as I'm closing this presentation, I've got a quick quiz for you so that you can do a bit of a self-assessment. You can do this just with a pen and paper. You don't need to share it with anyone. I'm going to read through these questions, and if the question is true, give yourself 1 point. And if the question is false, give yourself 0 points. And then calculate them at the end. So first of all, do people feel able to express views without fear of backlash? That's all about psychological safety and building trust. Do leaders slow the pace of discussions when tension rises? This is all about radical candour, having those difficult, awkward conversations, being able to have good or healthy conflict. Do managers focus on the impact of behaviour instead of defending intention? Do teams have simple, agreed rules for difficult conversations? Do senior leaders show curiosity when views clash? Do employees raise concerns earlier rather than staying silent or waiting for conflict? And does your culture actively seek and consider different perspectives, not just welcome people? So give yourself a 1 if it's true, a 0 if it's not. There's no judgment here. This is just to kind of get a temperature check, if you like. If you got 7 out of 7, that's brilliant. Please share what you're doing well with other people and share your knowledge and experiences. If you got 1 or 3, don't get disheartened by that. It's just an indicator that there's room for improvement. So we can think about some practical action plans to put in place. But thanks ever so much for tuning into this session today. Hopefully that's been useful for you, and it's given you some practical things that you can implement in your organization. If you do need any support from me in terms of implementation, then I'm only an email away, and my email address is just toby@milden.co.uk. Thanks very much.